They were always there. In the background of photos on the edge of the stage, flanking him as he walked through a crowd, a wall of Southern boys in sharp suits and dark glasses. They called them the Memphis Mafia. The name stuck. It was half joke, half truth. They were Elvis Presley's inner circle. His friends, his family, his employees, his protectors. They lived with him, worked for him, and partied with him. They saw everything. But what did they really see? And what did they do about it? For decades, the story of the Memphis Mafia has been a story of contradictions. Were they loyal bodyguards who would have taken a bullet for the king? Or were they enablers who watched him slowly self-destruct, too afraid of losing their paychecks to intervene? Did they protect him from the world, or did they isolate him within a prison of his own fame? He bought them cars, houses, and jewelry. He fired them on a whim. They loved him. Some of them sued him. They wrote books praising him, and they wrote books that exposed his darkest secrets. The story of Elvis is not just the story of one man. It's the story of the small circle of men who orbited him. Their lives were defined by his. And after he died on August 16th, 1977, they were left to explain what happened. Their accounts often conflict. Their motives are still questioned. They hold the keys to understanding the man behind the myth, but their stories raise as many questions as they answer. More than 40 years after his death, the mysteries surrounding the Memphis Mafia are as deep and dark as ever. We think we know the story, but we only know the pieces they chose to give us. Number 16, were they loyal friends or paid employees? It's the first question you have to ask. Were these guys really his friends? Or was it all just a job? The answer seems to be a very messy both. On the surface, it looked like the ultimate friendship. Here was a guy, Elvis, who hit the big time and brought his buddies along for the ride. Many of them he knew from Memphis long before he was famous. Billy Smith was his cousin, his closest family link inside the group. Red West and Elvis played football together at Humes High School. George Klein was a classmate. They were the boys from home, a slice of normality in a surreal world. Their life together looked like a boy's dream. They had epic firecracker wars at Graceland. They rented out entire amusement parks and movie theaters to play in after hours. They rode horses, go-karts, and motorcycles across the property. As Jerry Schilling describes in his book Me and a Guy Named Elvis, there was a genuine camaraderie. They had inside jokes, they had a shared history, they were a band of brothers, and Elvis was their leader. He needed them. He was famously lonely and hated being by himself. He needed the noise, the activity, the presence of his guys to feel secure. He trusted them to protect his body, to run his errands, to be his shield against an adoring but overwhelming public. But there was always a catch. Elvis paid the bills. He was the boss. That changes things. It wasn't a friendship of equals. They lived in his house, ate his food, and drove cars he bought them. Their salaries weren't huge by today's standards, but the perks were incredible. He showered them with gifts, rings, necklaces, cars, even houses for some. This generosity created a powerful bond, but it was also a form of control. Joe Esposito, often seen as the foreman of the group, managed the logistics and finances. He was an employee in a very real sense. He handled the payroll. The power imbalance was always there. Elvis had a notoriously short temper. He could turn on them in an instant. He could fire them for the smallest perceived slight. And he did. In July 1976, he fired Red West, Sonny West, and Dave Hebler. The reasons are still debated, ranging from cost-cutting measures suggested by Elvis's father, Vernon, to Elvis's growing paranoia. But the message was clear. This was not an unbreakable bond of friendship. It was a conditional arrangement. You were in the circle as long as Elvis wanted you there. The moment you weren't, you were out. Alana Nash's book, Elvis Aaron Presley Revelations from the Memphis Mafia, is built on extensive interviews with Marty Lacker, Lamar Fike, and Billy Smith. They speak with incredible candor about the dual nature of their relationship with Elvis. They loved him like a brother. They also feared him like a boss. They describe walking on eggshells, trying to manage his moods, always aware that their livelihood depended on his happiness. Lamar Fike put it bluntly. Elvis was the king, and everyone else was a subject. You didn't talk back to the king. So were they friends or employees? The truth is they were something in between, a category that doesn't really exist in normal life. They were professional friends. Their job was to be his companion, his confidant, and his protector. The lines were so blurred that they probably couldn't tell where the friendship ended and the job began. It was a golden cage for them, just as Graceland was for him. They had everything they could want except the freedom to be a true equal friend. What do we still not know? If Elvis had lived but lost all his money, how many of the Memphis Mafia would have stayed by his side? Did Elvis, in his heart, truly see them as brothers, or did he view them as possessions he could buy and discard? And perhaps the most unsettling question, did any of them ever feel, even for a single moment, that they were his equal? Number 15, what was their real relationship with Colonel Tom Parker? If there was one person who held more power over Elvis than anyone, it was his manager, Colonel Tom Parker. And if there was one person the Memphis Mafia universally seemed to distrust, it was also the Colonel. Their relationship was a long Cold War fought in the background of Elvis's career. To the Mafia, the Colonel was a carnival huckster who didn't understand Elvis the artist. To the Colonel, the Mafia was a group of freeloaders, an unnecessary expense and a barrier between him and his client. From the start, the Colonel saw the guys as a nuisance. He managed Elvis, not his entourage. According to many accounts, including those in Peter Guralnick's definitive biography, Careless Love the Unmaking of Elvis Presley, Parker constantly complained to Elvis about the cost of keeping the Mafia around. He saw the salaries, the cars, the gifts, as money coming directly out of his and Elvis's pockets. The Colonel was famously frugal, a man who would reuse paper clips. The idea of paying a dozen guys to just hang around was offensive to his business sense. The Mafia, in turn, saw the Colonel as the man who was ruining Elvis's career. They were there in the 1960s when Elvis was stuck making a string of terrible, formulaic movies in Hollywood. They heard Elvis complain. They knew he wanted better scripts, more serious roles. They blamed the Colonel for signing him up for film after film, each one worse than the last, simply because it was an easy paycheck. Marty Lacker was particularly vocal about this, claiming he and others tried to get Elvis to see that the Colonel was holding him back. In Revelations from the Memphis Mafia, Lacker recounts conversations where they would beg Elvis to stand up to his manager, but Elvis almost never would. The conflict was not just about creative differences, it was about access and control. The Colonel wanted to be the sole gatekeeper to Elvis. The Mafia was a physical and emotional buffer that he couldn't always get through. Joe Esposito, who had a more professional relationship with the Colonel than most, often acted as the go-between. But even he was loyal to Elvis first. The Colonel knew that if the Mafia ever truly convinced Elvis to leave him, his golden goose would be gone. There was also a deep cultural divide. The Colonel was an older, Dutch-born immigrant, a fact he hid his entire life with a carny background. The Memphis Mafia were young Southern boys. They didn't speak the same language, literally or figuratively. They saw the Colonel's management style as exploitative. For example, they were horrified by the sheer amount of cheap, tacky merchandise the Colonel would license with Elvis's name on it. They felt it cheapened his image. The Colonel saw it as pure profit. The dynamic came to a head in the 1970s. The guys were thrilled when Elvis returned to live performing in 1969. This was the real Elvis, the one they believed in. But they watched in frustration as the Colonel booked him into the same Las Vegas hotel year after year with a touring schedule that was grueling and repetitive. They saw Elvis get bored. They saw him get tired. They blamed the Colonel for working him too hard, for not seeking out new challenges like a European tour, which Elvis desperately wanted to do. The Colonel, being an illegal immigrant without a passport, could never travel abroad, so he ensured Elvis never did either, a fact that still stuns many fans. The relationship was one of mutual suspicion. The Colonel thought they were a bad influence, encouraging Elvis's worst spending habits. They thought he was a greedy manipulator who was artistically and financially bleeding Elvis dry. Both sides were probably right to some extent. What are the questions that remain? How many serious career opportunities, from movie roles to tours, did the Colonel deliberately sabotage without Elvis or the Mafia ever finding out? Did any of the Memphis Mafia ever try to go behind Elvis's back to orchestrate a plan to get rid of the Colonel? And what was the final unspoken truth? Was Elvis's deep-seated loyalty to the Colonel a form of respect, or was it a form of fear? Number 14, how did they really feel about Priscilla? When Priscilla Beaulieu entered Elvis's life, she wasn't just entering a relationship with a man, she was entering a relationship with his entire entourage. For the Memphis Mafia, the arrival of a serious girlfriend, and later a wife, fundamentally changed the dynamic of their world. Their feelings about her were complex, contradictory, and evolved dramatically over time. Initially, when Priscilla first came to Graceland from Germany in 1962 as a teenager, the guys treated her like a little sister. They were protective of her. They saw that Elvis was genuinely captivated by her. In their accounts, they describe a sweet but naive girl trying to navigate an impossible situation. She was a kid living in a rock star's mansion, surrounded by his male friends. And Jerry Schilling, in particular, expresses a lot of sympathy for her in his book, highlighting how isolated she must have felt. They were the insiders, she was the outsider, but as the relationship grew more serious, tensions began to emerge. Priscilla represented a threat to the boys' club atmosphere that had defined Graceland for years. She wanted a more normal home life. She wanted time alone with Elvis. That meant less time for the guys. Suddenly, there was someone else competing for Elvis's attention, someone with a level of intimacy they could never have. In Revelations from the Memphis Mafia, Marty Lacker and others admit that there was jealousy. They were used to having Elvis all to themselves. Priscilla, for her part, found the constant presence of the Memphis Mafia suffocating. In her own book, Elvis and Me, she describes a life with no privacy. The guys were always there, day and night. She couldn't have a private conversation or a quiet dinner with her husband. She details her frustration at trying to create a home while living in what was essentially a 24-hour clubhouse. She tried to assert some control to get Elvis to set boundaries with his friends, but it was a losing battle, and Elvis needed them there. Their presence was his security blanket. This created a natural friction. Some of the guys saw her as a controlling influence, trying to change Elvis and get rid of them. They would sometimes mock her behind her back. Priscilla saw them as overgrown boys who were holding Elvis back, preventing him from maturing. The truth, as usual, was somewhere in the middle. They were two competing forces in his life, both wanting what was best for him, but with very different ideas of what best looked like. When Elvis and Priscilla's marriage began to crumble in the early 1970s, the Mafia had a front row seat. Their loyalties were, first and foremost, to Elvis. They saw his pain and his anger. Some of them likely blamed Priscilla for the breakdown of the marriage, particularly after she began an affair with karate instructor Mike Stone. From their perspective, she had betrayed the king. However, others, like Jerry Schilling, maintained a relationship with Priscilla even after the divorce, understanding that the situation was not black and white. After Elvis's death, Priscilla became the executor of his estate, a move that put her in a position of ultimate power over his legacy. This created a new and more complicated dynamic with the remaining members of the Mafia. Suddenly, the woman some of them had seen as an outsider was in charge of everything. This led to new alliances and new resentments that linger to this day. So what are the biggest unknowns? How many of the guys actively worked to undermine Priscilla's influence with Elvis during their marriage? Did Priscilla ever try to get Elvis to fire specific members of the group? And if so, who? And when they look back now, do the surviving members see her as the woman who broke Elvis's heart, or as the woman who ultimately saved his legacy from financial ruin? Number 13, did they control access to Elvis, or did Elvis control them? One of the most persistent images of the Memphis Mafia is that of a human wall. They were the gatekeepers. If you wanted to get to Elvis, you had to go through him. This has led to a long-standing debate. Did they isolate Elvis from the outside world for his own good, or did they do it to protect their own privileged positions? And who was really in charge of the guest list? The argument that they controlled access is a powerful one. By the late 1960s, Elvis was one of the most famous people on the planet. He couldn't walk down the street. He couldn't go to a store. The Mafia's primary job was to manage this reality. They screened phone calls, they vetted visitors, they kept the media and overzealous fans at a distance. Joe Esposito and Marty Lacker, in their roles as foremen at different times, were the primary schedulers and organizers. They decided who got an audience and who didn't. This gave them immense power. There are countless stories of people, from old friends to Hollywood executives, being unable to get a message to Elvis because it was blocked by one of the guys. Was this always on Elvis's orders, or did the Mafia sometimes make executive decisions, believing they were protecting him from people who would use him or bring him down? In Alana Nash's book, the guys admit to filtering out what they considered negative influences. They saw themselves as his protectors, and sometimes that meant making choices for him. They knew his moods and his weaknesses better than anyone. They knew when he was vulnerable and when he was strong. However, the counter-argument is just as compelling. Elvis was the one in total control. The Memphis Mafia did exactly what he wanted them to do. If he didn't want to see someone, he would tell one of the guys to handle it. This allowed Elvis to avoid direct confrontation. He could remain the good guy, while his friends took the heat for turning someone away. He used them as a buffer not just against the public, but against personal and professional obligations he wanted to avoid. Peter Guralnick's research supports this view. He portrays an Elvis who was far from a passive puppet. He was the master of his own universe at Graceland. He set the tone, he gave the orders. The guys were an extension of his will. If they ever overstepped their bounds and turned away someone he truly wanted to see, he would let them know in no uncertain terms. The ultimate power to hire, fire, and command rested solely with him. They were the guards of the castle, but he was the king who told them when to raise and lower the drawbridge. The truth is probably a mixture of both. In his stronger, more lucid periods, Elvis was absolutely in command. The Mafia were his loyal soldiers. But as his health declined and his prescription drug use escalated in the mid-1970s, he became more reclusive and paranoid. In these later years, it's possible the guys took on a more active role in managing his isolation. They may have made more decisions on his behalf, believing he was not in a state to make them himself. They were trying to manage a chaotic situation, and in doing so, they may have tightened the circle around him even more, inadvertently deepening his isolation. This dynamic became a prison. He was trapped by his fame, and they were the guards. But they were also prisoners in the same gilded cage, their lives completely dependent on the whims of their isolated king. What do we still need to know? Are there specific documented instances of the Memphis Mafia turning away a major career opportunity or a crucial personal connection without Elvis's knowledge? How often did they lie to people on Elvis's behalf? And what was the emotional toll of being his constant excuse makers? And perhaps the most crucial question in his final years, did their protection cross the line from helpful to harmful, cutting him off from outside help that might have saved his life? Number 12, what was the true purpose of the book Elvis, What Happened? In July 1977, just 1 month before Elvis died, a book hit the shelves that blew the lid off the myth. It was called Elvis, What Happened, and it was written by 3 former members of the Memphis Mafia, Red West, his cousin Sonny West, and former karate expert bodyguard Dave Hebler. The book was a bombshell. It detailed Elvis's raging prescription drug abuse, his volatile temper, his obsession with guns, and his bizarre spiritual quests. For the first time, the public was getting a look at the dark side of the king. For decades, the purpose of this book has been furiously debated. Was it a desperate last-ditch attempt to save a friend's life? Or was it a bitter act of revenge by 3 disgruntled ex-employees? The cry for help argument is the one the authors themselves have always maintained. All 3 men had been fired by Elvis a year earlier in what they described as a sudden and brutal dismissal. And they claimed they were worried sick about him, they saw his health rapidly deteriorating, they had tried to talk to him about his drug problem, but he wouldn't listen. According to their narrative, they believed that by publishing the book, they could shock Elvis into seeing the truth. The public exposure, they hoped, would force him to confront his demons and get help. Sonny West, in particular, was emotional in interviews about this, insisting their only motive was to save the life of the man they still loved. They also claimed they needed the money. Being fired from Elvis's entourage meant not only losing a job, but losing a whole way of life. They were suddenly on the outside, with families to support and few marketable skills beyond protecting Elvis. A tell-all book was a quick way to generate income. This financial motive doesn't necessarily contradict the cry for help theory. The two could have coexisted. The revenge argument is just as powerful, and it's the one that many fans and remaining members of the inner circle subscribe to. From their perspective, Red, Sonny, and Dave had committed the ultimate act of betrayal. They had broken the code of silence. They were airing the family's dirty laundry in public for profit. Marty Lacker and others were furious, seeing it as a cheap shot against a man who was clearly unwell. They argued that if the authors were so concerned, they should have tried harder to intervene in private. Going public was unforgivable. Elvis himself was reportedly devastated by the book. He felt profoundly betrayed by men he considered brothers, especially Red West, who had been with him since high school. A biographer, Peter Guralnick, describes Elvis as being both heartbroken and deeply ashamed. The book confirmed his worst fears about his secrets being exposed. Instead of being a wake-up call, it seems to have pushed him further into despair and isolation in his final weeks. The timing is what makes it all so tragic. Had Elvis lived and gotten clean, the book might have been seen as the tough love that saved him. But because he died just a few weeks after its publication, it is forever tainted by his death. It reads like an obituary written while the subject was still alive. For the authors, it meant a lifetime of being branded as the traitors who kicked their friend when he was down. So what was the true purpose? It was likely a tangled mess of all these motives. They were hurt and angry about being fired, they needed money, and they were genuinely terrified of watching their friend kill himself. The book was a product of that toxic cocktail of anger, greed, and fear. It was a clumsy, desperate, and ultimately tragic act. What are the lingering questions? Did the book's publisher push the authors to include more sensational details to guarantee sales? Were there other members of the Memphis Mafia who secretly supported the book, but were too afraid to say so publicly? And the most haunting question of all in the final, private moments of his life, did Elvis ever consider that the book, despite the pain it caused, was an act of love? Number 11, could they have staged an intervention? This is perhaps the most painful question for the members of the Memphis Mafia and for anyone who studies Elvis's life. With so many people around him watching him decline, why didn't they do more? Why didn't they physically stop him? Could they have organized a formal intervention to force him into treatment? The simple answer, and the one the guys themselves often give, is that it wasn't possible. You have to remember the context of the time and the power dynamics at play. In the 1970s, the concept of a celebrity intervention, as we know it today, didn't really exist. The Betty Ford Center wouldn't open until 1982. The public understanding of addiction as a disease was minimal. To many, it was a moral failure, a lack of willpower. More importantly, there was the sheer force of Elvis's personality. He was not just their friend, he was their boss, their benefactor, the king. His word was law in his own home. To stage an intervention would have meant confronting him directly, something almost no one ever dared to do. Lamar Fique is quoted in Revelations from the Memphis Mafia as saying that confronting Elvis about the drugs was a fireable offense. And he was right. Elvis surrounded himself with people who would say yes. Anyone who consistently said no or challenged him was quickly exiled from the group. They did try, in their own ways. Several members, including Red West and Jerry Schilling, described private conversations where they would plead with Elvis to cut back on the pills. They would try to throw the pills away, only for Elvis to fly into a rage and call one of his doctors to get a new prescription. The problem was that Elvis had a network of doctors, most notably Dr. George Nicopolis, Dr. Nick, who would supply him with whatever he wanted. The guys were trying to plug a leak in a dam that had dozens of other holes. Elvis had the money and the fame to bypass any obstacles they put in his way. The infamous book, Elvis, What Happened, can be seen as a form of public intervention, a desperate, ill-conceived attempt to do what they couldn't do in private. It was their way of shouting for help when whispering had failed. However, critics argue they could have done more. They could have banded together if the entire Memphis Mafia, Joe Esposito, Marty Lacker, Jerry Schilling, Billy Smith, all of them, he had walked into his room together and said, Elvis, we're not working for you anymore until you get help. It might have had an impact. It would have been a massive risk. He might have fired them all on the spot. But it might also have been the one shock that could have broken through his denial. This collective action never happened. The group was often fractured by internal rivalries, and they were all financially dependent on him. The risk of losing everything was too great. Priscilla Presley has also spoken about her own failed attempts to get Elvis to stop. She tried, but he would dismiss her concerns. If his own wife and the mother of his child couldn't get through to him, it's hard to imagine that his employees, however close, could have succeeded. He was an expert at manipulating people and turning them against each other to maintain his own control over the situation. Ultimately, they were trapped. They were in an emotionally and financially dependent relationship with an addict who held all the power. Their attempts were small, individual, and easily defeated. A united front was the only thing that might have worked, and it was the one thing they were unable or unwilling to form. What are the questions we can never answer? If they had united and confronted him, what is the realistic probability he would have listened versus just firing them all and hiring a new crew? Did they ever have a secret meeting without Elvis to specifically discuss a group intervention? And if so, who shot the idea down? And in their quietest moments of reflection, do the surviving members feel they did all they could, or do they live with a profound sense of guilt? Number 10, how deep did their knowledge of his drug use go? Everyone knows Elvis had a drug problem. But the members of the Memphis Mafia were not just aware of it, they were living inside of it. They were the ones who saw him take the pills, the ones who sometimes had to fetch them for him, and the ones who had to deal with the consequences. The real question isn't if they knew, but how much they knew. Did they understand the pharmacology? Did they know the sheer quantity and the deadly combinations he was taking? In the early days, it all seemed harmless enough. Elvis started using amphetamines, or uppers, in the army in the late 1950s to stay awake on duty. When he came back, he shared them with the guys. They would use them to stay up for their all-night parties and long road trips. At the same time, he used sleeping pills, or downers, to come down from the uppers and get some sleep. To them, it wasn't drug abuse. It was just a way to manage an insane schedule. As Marty Lacker described it, they didn't see them as street drugs, they were prescriptions from a doctor. In their minds, that made it legitimate. As the years went on, particularly into the 1970s, the use escalated dramatically. It was no longer just about staying awake or getting to sleep. Elvis was taking a staggering cocktail of narcotics, sedatives, and amphetamines to get through the day. The guys were the ones who carried his little black medical bag. They were the ones who would receive packages from Dr. Nick. Joe Esposito and others had the job of setting out his pills for him at night. But did they know what they were handling? According to their own testimony in various books and documentaries, for the most part, they did not. They knew the pills by their street names: uppers, downers, sleepers. They knew he was taking Demerol for pain. But they weren't pharmacists. They didn't understand the chemical interactions between a powerful barbiturate like amytal and a narcotic like Dilaudid. They just knew that Dr. Nick had prescribed them, and Elvis wanted them. They were following orders. The book Elvis What Happened was the first time the specific names of many of the drugs were made public: amytal, nembutal, seconal, placidil, quaalude, Demerol, Dilaudid. Red and Sonny West detailed the routine of Elvis sending them to the pharmacy or having Dr. Nick fly in with new supplies. They describe his slurred speech, his erratic behavior, his onstage stumbles. They knew he was in a bad way, that he was addicted. They saw the physical decline. What they may not have fully grasped was how close to death he was on a daily basis. After Elvis died, the toxicology report was shocking. The coroner found 14 different drugs in his system, 10 in significant quantities. It was a pharmacy of depressants. When the members of the Mafia saw that list, it was likely the first time many of them understood the full lethal scope of his addiction. They had been seeing the symptoms, but the toxicology report revealed the cause in stark scientific detail. What some have accused the group of being willfully blind, it was easier not to ask too many questions. It was easier to just give him the pills he asked for than to face his wrath. Their job was to keep him happy, and the pills made him, in the short term, functional and calm. Questioning the doctors or refusing Elvis's requests would have jeopardized their position. They were caught in a classic enabler's dilemma. Do you make the addict happy now, or do you risk their anger to try and save them later? Most of the time, they chose the path of least resistance. What are the deepest unanswered questions? Did any member of the group, perhaps Joe Esposito or Charlie Hodge, who were often closest to him, keep a private log or have a more detailed understanding of the specific drugs and dosages than they have ever admitted? Was Dr. Nick ever candid with any of them about the true danger of the prescriptions he was writing? And if one of them had taken the medical bag to an independent doctor and asked, what would this cocktail do to a man? Would history have turned out differently? Number 9, were they complicit in his decline or helpless witnesses? This question cuts to the heart of the Memphis Mafia's moral standing. It's the line between watching a tragedy unfold and helping it happen. Were they active participants in Elvis's self-destruction, or were they powerless observers trapped in the orbit of a dying star? The evidence suggests they were, tragically, a bit of both. The argument for them being helpless witnesses is strong. Elvis was a grown man, and he was the most powerful person in their lives. He had access to doctors and money that they couldn't control. As many of them have stated, telling Elvis no was not a real option if you wanted to remain in his circle. They were young men, mostly from poor backgrounds with little formal education. They were completely out of their depth dealing with a level of fame, wealth, and addiction that was unprecedented. They were not trained medical professionals or addiction counselors. They were bodyguards and roadies. They witnessed his decline with what seems to be genuine horror and sadness. They saw him gain weight. They saw him fall asleep mid-sentence. They had to help him on and off stage on his worst nights. In the 1977 TV special, Elvis in Concert, filmed just weeks before his death, the physical decay is shocking. The guys are there, on the side of the stage watching him. The looks on their faces are a mixture of concern and resignation. They were watching a slow-motion car crash, and they didn't know how to grab the wheel. Well, Jerry Schilling has spoken about the profound sense of helplessness he felt during this period. However, the case for their complicity is deeply troubling. They were not just passive observers. They were at times active facilitators. They were the ones who answered the door for the doctors. They were the ones who sometimes had to call the pharmacy. They were the ones who physically handed him the envelopes of pills. By performing these actions, they moved from being witnesses to being part of the machinery of his addiction. Yeah. They were also complicit in shielding him from the consequences of his actions. They helped cover up his collapses and his hospitalizations, often explaining them away to the public as exhaustion or the flu. They ensured that no one from the outside world, no critical journalist, no truly independent doctor, no old friend who might speak a hard truth could get close enough to see the full extent of the problem. They maintained the bubble of denial around him. This wasn't necessarily malicious. They were protecting his career and his image, which was part of their job. But in doing so, they also protected his disease. The financial aspect cannot be ignored. Their entire livelihood depended on Elvis continuing to be Elvis. If he stopped working, they stopped getting paid. This created a massive conflict of interest. Challenging his drug use in a meaningful way would have meant risking the gravy train. It's an uncomfortable truth, but their financial self-interest was directly tied to maintaining the status quo, even as the status quo was killing him. The most charitable interpretation is that they were in an impossible situation and made a series of small compromises that, over time, added up to a monumental failure. Each individual act getting him a glass of water for his pills, telling a reporter he was just tired seemed minor at the moment. But collectively, they built a wall that prevented him from getting the help he needed. They were both victims of his addiction and, in a way, its caretakers. So what are the things we'll never truly know? How many times did one of them actively lie to a doctor or a pharmacist to obtain more drugs for Elvis? Was there ever a point where they stopped trying to help and simply resigned themselves to being caretakers of an addict? And what is the weight of their complicity? Were they like soldiers just following orders, or did they, at some level, become co-conspirators in his slow suicide? Number 8, was there a hierarchy, and who really held the power? In any group of people, a power structure emerges. The Memphis Mafia was no different. While from the outside they looked like a single unit, a pack of loyal followers, inside there was a clear, if unstated, hierarchy. Understanding this internal dynamic is key to understanding how the group functioned and dysfunctioned. At the very top, of course, was Elvis. He was the undisputed king. His power was absolute. But beneath him, there were layers of influence and responsibility. For much of their history, there was a designated foreman, a kind of chief of staff who managed the other guys and acted as the main liaison between Elvis and the outside world. For a long time, this role was held by Joe Esposito. Joe was organized, professional, and had a good head for business. He handled the logistics of tours, managed payroll, and often dealt with Colonel Parker. He was seen as the most corporate of the group. Marty Lacker also held the foreman position for a period. Lacker was more of a confidant, someone Elvis trusted with his personal feelings and frustrations. His power was less logistical and more emotional. He was one of the few who would occasionally challenge Elvis on his decisions, particularly regarding his career. This gave him a unique but precarious position in the hierarchy. Then there were the inner circle guys. These were the ones who had the most personal access to Elvis, the ones he wanted around in his private moments. His cousin Billy Smith was arguably the closest. They grew up together, and there was a family bond that transcended the employer-employee relationship. Charlie Hodge, who lived at Graceland, was another. His job was to hand Elvis his scarves and water on stage, but his real role was that of a constant calming presence. Jerry Schilling was also part of this core group, a friend Elvis trusted deeply with his thoughts and vulnerabilities. The next tier was the security team. Red West and Sonny West were the primary bodyguards for years. Their power was physical. They were the muscle, the enforcers. Their role was to protect and to intimidate when necessary. They were deeply loyal, But their relationship with Elvis was less about emotional intimacy and more about a shared history and a code of protection. At the outer edges were guys like Lamar Fike, Alan Fortas, and others who came and went over the years. They were part of the crew essential to the social fabric, but they didn't have the same level of influence as the foreman or the inner circle. Lamar Fike, however, held a special place. He was one of the original guys and known for his sharp wit and cynical worldview, which Elvis seemed to enjoy. This hierarchy was not static. It was constantly shifting based on Elvis's moods. Someone who was in favor one week could be in the doghouse the next. Elvis was a master at playing the guys off one another. He would tell one person a secret and swear them to secrecy, then tell another person the same secret. This kept them all on their toes and ensured their ultimate loyalty was to him, not to each other. It was a classic divide and conquer strategy, whether conscious or not. The power struggles were real. There was jealousy over who got to spend the most time with Elvis, who got the nicer car, who got the more important job on a tour. This internal competition prevented them from ever forming a truly united front, which, as discussed earlier, might have been the only thing that could have saved Elvis from himself. They were all competing for the favor of the king, and in that competition, the king's well-being sometimes became a secondary concern. What are the power dynamics we still can't see? How many secret alliances and rivalries existed within the group that have never been revealed? Who was the most influential voice in Elvis's ear during his darkest moments in the mid-1970s? And if Elvis had named a successor or a single person to be in charge if something happened to him, who would he have chosen? Number 7. How did they manage the women in Elvis's life? And Elvis Presley was a magnet for women. From screaming fans to Hollywood co-stars to the young women he dated, his life was a constant parade of female attention. For the Memphis Mafia, managing this aspect of Elvis's life was one of their most delicate and demanding jobs. They were the gatekeepers, the schedulers, the secret keepers, and sometimes, the breakup artists. Their role started with vetting. When Elvis was single, particularly in the 1960s, and after his divorce in 1973, the guys were often tasked with finding him dates. They would meet women, and if they thought Elvis would be interested, they would arrange an introduction. They had a specific type. They looked for young, beautiful, often dark-haired, and most importantly, discreet. They had to be girls who wouldn't run to the press. The guys acted as a screening process to protect Elvis from women who might try to exploit him. Once a woman entered Elvis's orbit, the Mafia's job was to manage the logistics. They would arrange for her to be flown in, put her up in a hotel, and bring her to Elvis when he was ready. They also had the awkward task of managing multiple women at the same time. Elvis often had several girlfriends at once, and it was up to the guys to keep them from running into each other. This involved intricate scheduling that would rival a military operation. In Alana Nash's Revelations, the guys described these situations with a kind of dark humor, detailing near misses in hotel lobbies and the complex lies they had to tell. They were also the enforcers of Elvis's rules. Elvis had very specific ideas about how his girlfriend should look and act. The guys would often be the ones to communicate these expectations. They were also the ones who had to ensure privacy. No cameras, no reporters, no talk. They were protecting his image as much as his person. Perhaps their most difficult job was ending the relationships. Elvis hated confrontation. When he grew tired of a girlfriend, he would rarely break up with her himself. He would send one of the guys to do it for him. Joe Esposito or another senior member would be tasked with telling the woman that it was over, giving her some money or a parting gift like a car, and putting her on a plane home. It was a cold, impersonal process, but it was how Elvis operated. The Mafia had to be the bad guy so Elvis could remain the charming, elusive star. Their relationship with these women was complicated. On one hand, they were just following orders. On the other, they were active participants in a system that often treated women as disposable. They became friends with some of the long-term girlfriends like Linda Thompson and Ginger Alden. They saw the genuine affection that existed, but they also saw the heartbreak and the dismissive way relationships could end. This role put them in a strange moral position. They were protecting their friend and boss, but they were also enabling a lifestyle that was, by today's standards, deeply problematic. They were the architects of the fantasy world where Elvis could have anything and anyone he wanted without any of the normal consequences or responsibilities of a real relationship. What are the stories that have never been told? How many potential scandals or paternity claims did the Memphis Mafia have to quietly handle and pay off over the years? What was the true emotional toll on the guys who had to constantly lie to and manipulate these women on Elvis's behalf? And did any of the women who were dismissed ever try to get revenge on the group for their role in the breakup? Number 6. What did they think of his movies and his Vegas career? Elvis's career can be split into several distinct phases, but the two most commercially dominant were his Hollywood movie era in the 1960s and his Las Vegas residency era in the 1970s. The Memphis Mafia was there for all of it, and their opinions on the quality of his work were often at odds with the decisions being made by Colonel Parker. The movie years were a source of immense frustration for the group. They were there with him in Hollywood, living in rented mansions, and they saw his artistic disillusionment up close. In the beginning, there was excitement. Movies like Jailhouse Rock and King Creole had grit and allowed Elvis to act. But by the mid-60s, the films had devolved into a predictable formula. Elvis plays a race car driver, pilot, fisherman, sings a few silly songs to a group of pretty girls, gets into a soft fight, and wins the day. The guys knew he hated it. They heard him complain. In their books, Marty Lacker and Jerry Schilling describe an Elvis who was bored and embarrassed by the material he was given. He wanted to be a serious actor like his idols Marlon Brando and James Dean. He had the potential, but the Colonel just wanted the quick, guaranteed paycheck from the movie and soundtrack package deal. The Mafia shared Elvis's frustration. They were fans of the rebellious, innovative Elvis of the 1950s. They were watching him turn into a parody of himself. They blamed the Colonel entirely for this creative stagnation. According to Lacker, they would try to encourage Elvis to stand up to the Colonel, but Elvis felt trapped by his contracts and his loyalty. The return to live performing in 1969 was a moment of triumph for them. The 68 comeback special was the first step. They saw the fire return to his eyes. This was the Elvis they believed in. When he opened in Las Vegas at the International Hotel, the initial shows were electric. He was in great shape, his voice was powerful, and he was taking risks on stage. The guys were incredibly proud. They felt he was finally reclaiming his legacy as the greatest performer in the world. But even the Vegas dream began to sour. The Colonel booked him for relentless seasons in the same venue. What was once exciting became a repetitive grind. The guys saw the boredom set in again. The set list became predictable. Elvis started to go through the motions on some nights. His infamous on-stage rants and bizarre monologues in the later years were a clear sign to them that he was not in a good place. They also saw the physical toll the Vegas lifestyle was taking. The shows were late, which meant he had to take uppers to get ready and downers to get to sleep afterward. Vegas was a 24-hour city that fed all of his worst habits. The isolation of the hotel penthouse, where he would stay for weeks on end, was profound. The Mafia was his only link to the outside world. While the tours that broke up the Vegas residencies were a change of scenery, they were grueling. City after city, show after show, they watched him get heavier and more dependent on his prescription medications to just get through it. So their feelings were clear. They hated the silly movies and loved the serious ones. They loved the initial return to the stage, but grew to resent the monotonous and destructive nature of the Vegas grind. In both cases, they saw the Colonel as the villain, choosing the easy money over Elvis's artistic health and long-term well-being. They were the audience that never left, and they had the best and worst seat in the house. What do we still not know? Were there specific movie scripts for serious roles that Elvis was offered, but that the Colonel rejected without ever telling him? During the Vegas years, did the guys ever try to alter the set list or encourage him to add new, more challenging material against the Colonel's wishes? And what was their unfiltered, private opinion of the rhinestone jumpsuit image that came to define his later career? Number 5, were there financial abuses we don't know about? Elvis Presley made a phenomenal amount of money. He was one of the highest earning entertainers of his time. But he also spent it at an astonishing rate. The financial world around Elvis was a chaotic, cash-based system largely managed by his father Vernon and Colonel Parker. The Memphis Mafia were the beneficiaries of this system, but they were also in a position to see its flaws and, potentially, to exploit them. The official narrative is that the guys were on a salary and received generous bonuses and gifts. But the day-to-day finances were loose. Elvis was famous for carrying huge wads of cash. If someone needed something, he would just peel off the bills. This lack of formal accounting created an environment where abuse was possible. Allegations have swirled for years. Were there members who padded expense accounts on tour? Were there kickbacks from jewelers or car dealers who knew that a recommendation from one of the guys could lead to a huge sale to Elvis? Given the sheer volume of money and valuables flowing through the organization, it seems almost inevitable that some level of skimming or opportunism occurred. However, proving it is nearly impossible. Some of the guys were more business savvy than others. And Joe Esposito and Marty Lacker, as foremen, had a better understanding of the finances. They were in charge of budgets and payroll. Their position gave them more opportunity, but also more scrutiny. Most of the other guys were simply not in a position to commit large-scale financial fraud. Their power was in their proximity to Elvis, not in their access to his bank accounts. The bigger financial questions lie with the two men at the top, Vernon Presley and Colonel Parker. Vernon was notoriously tight-fisted and suspicious, yet he oversaw an empire that was hemorrhaging cash on impulse buys. The Colonel's management contract, which gave him an unheard of 50% of some earnings, is now widely seen as predatory. The Mafia saw this. They often complained that the Colonel was taking far too much and that Vernon was too unsophisticated to manage the books properly. They saw Elvis spending fortunes on cars and jewelry for them and others, while the Colonel was pocketing half of his actual earnings. So, did the Mafia themselves abuse their financial position? It's likely there were minor abuses, the kind of things that happen in any cash-rich, loosely managed organization. But there has never been any credible evidence of a major systematic effort by any of them to defraud Elvis. The real financial story isn't about the Mafia stealing from Elvis, but about the deeply flawed structure set up by the Colonel and Vernon, a structure the Mafia could only watch and whisper about. They were recipients of the largesse, but they weren't in control of the vault. The most damning financial story involving the group came after Elvis's death. Some members sold their stories and memorabilia. While this is their right, it has been seen by many fans as profiting from his memory. But this was an act of financial survival after their world collapsed, not an abuse that happened during his lifetime. What are the lingering financial mysteries? What was the true total value of the gifts Elvis gave the Memphis Mafia over 2 decades? Are there sealed financial records or legal settlements from the estate that hint at abuses that were dealt with privately? And if a forensic accountant were to go through all the receipts and records from the touring years, how much money would be simply unaccounted for? Number 4, what happened in the famous summit meeting with the Beatles? On August 27, 1965, the two biggest forces in popular music met for the one and only time. When Elvis Presley hosted the Beatles at his home in Bel Air, California, it was a top-secret meeting, a summit arranged by intermediaries. The Memphis Mafia were there, as was the Beatles' entourage. What actually happened that night has been the subject of myth and conflicting reports ever since. The basic facts are agreed upon. The Beatles arrived and were incredibly nervous. They were meeting their idol. Elvis, in turn, was meeting the band that had knocked him off the top of the charts. The initial atmosphere was awkward. According to most accounts, John, Paul, George, and Ringo just sat there, staring at Elvis, completely starstruck and silent. Elvis famously broke the ice by saying something like, "If you guys are just going to sit and stare at me, I'm going to bed." This got everyone laughing, and things loosened up. They started talking about music and touring. After Elvis played a bass guitar, Paul McCartney was thrilled. They had an impromptu jam session, though what they played is a matter of debate. Some say it was a few Chuck Berry songs, others don't recall any real songs being completed. Members of the Memphis Mafia, like Jerry Schilling, remember it as a friendly, if slightly surreal, evening. But there are other, darker versions of the story. Over the years, stories have emerged about Elvis's attitude toward the band. While he was outwardly gracious, he was privately resentful of their success and critical of their influence. He saw them as a threat. More disturbingly, he later developed a strong anti-drug and anti-communist stance, and he reportedly saw the Beatles, particularly John Lennon, as a corrupting anti-American influence. The most shocking story related to this comes from a meeting Elvis had with President Richard Nixon at the White House in 1970. Elvis, in a rambling letter, offered his services as a federal agent at large to help fight the war on drugs. During the meeting, of which there is a transcript, Elvis told Nixon that the Beatles had been a negative force. He said the Beatles came to this country, made their money, and then went back to England, where they promoted an anti-American theme. It's a stunning statement from the man who had hosted them just 5 years earlier. So what was the Memphis Mafia's role that night? They were the hosts alongside Elvis. They served drinks, made conversation, and tried to bridge the gap between the two entourages. They were witnesses to the entire interaction. Their accounts are crucial to understanding the true vibe of the evening. Most of them portray it as a respectful meeting of musical giants, but what did they hear in private? What did Elvis say to them after the Beatles left? Did he express admiration, jealousy, or contempt? This is where the story gets murky. Depending on which member you ask and when you ask them, you might get a different answer. It's possible Elvis's feelings were complex, a mixture of professional respect and personal rivalry. His later comments to Nixon suggest the rivalry and suspicion grew much stronger over time. What are the unanswered questions about that night? Was there really a proper jam session, and does a secret recording of it exist anywhere, as rumors have long suggested? What did the Memphis Mafia and the Beatles roadies talk about while their famous bosses were chatting? And did Elvis show any signs that night of the deep-seated animosity toward the band that he would later express to the President of the United States? Number 3. How much did they know about his spiritual seeking? Beyond the music, the movies, and the mayhem, there was another side to Elvis Presley, the spiritual seeker. Throughout his life, he was on a restless search for meaning, reading hundreds of books on religion, philosophy, and mysticism. The Memphis Mafia had a front-row seat to this deeply personal and often strange journey. But how much did they understand, and how much did they participate? Elvis was raised in the Assembly of God Church in Tupelo, Mississippi. Gospel music was his first love and remained a core part of his identity his whole life. He would often gather the guys around a piano late at night and sing gospel hymns for hours. This was a side of him they all knew and shared. It was familiar and comforting. But in the mid-1960s, his search took a sharp turn into the esoteric. He became deeply involved with his hairdresser, Larry Geller, who introduced him to a world of spiritual and mystical books. Elvis devoured texts like The Impersonal Life and Autobiography of a Yogi. He became fascinated with numerology, astrology, and the idea that he had a special spiritual purpose. For the Memphis Mafia, this was bizarre. Most of them were down-to-earth Southern boys. They didn't understand this new guru talk. According to many of their accounts, they were highly suspicious of Larry Geller. They saw him as a weird outside influence who was filling Elvis's head with strange ideas. They would mock Geller behind his back. There was a genuine fear that Geller was leading Elvis down a strange path away from his roots and his career. And Elvis was incredibly passionate about his newfound beliefs. He would try to get the guys to read the books. He would give long, rambling lectures about spiritual concepts. For the most part, the Mafia just nodded along. They weren't interested in revelations from the Memphis Mafia. Marty Lacker is very blunt about this. He says they thought it was mostly nonsense, but they humored Elvis because that's what they were paid to do, as they would pretend to read the books he gave them. This created a new kind of distance between Elvis and his friends. He was on a profound internal journey, and the people closest to him couldn't or wouldn't go with him. He was becoming more isolated, not just by his fame, but by his beliefs. Like Jerry Schilling was one of the few who seemed to take Elvis's quest more seriously, showing a genuine interest in reading some of the books. This created a special bond between them. The spiritual quest had a direct impact on his drug use. Elvis used the pills not just for sleep or energy, but as a tool for what he saw as spiritual exploration. He was trying to achieve altered states of consciousness. This fusion of genuine spiritual yearning and massive drug abuse is one of the central tragedies of his later years. The Mafia saw the drug part clearly, but they may have completely missed the spiritual motivation behind it, writing it all off as just part of his addiction. After a while, even Elvis seemed to pull back from the most intense phase of his spiritual search, partly because Colonel Parker became convinced it was bad for his all-American boy image. But he never stopped reading and searching. The books were always there by his bedside. What do we still not understand about this side of Elvis? How many of the Memphis Mafia secretly shared some of his spiritual interests, but were afraid to admit it to the rest of the group? Did Larry Geller, the spiritual guide, have a deeper, more manipulative influence over Elvis than anyone has ever revealed? And ultimately, in his final moments, did Elvis believe his spiritual quest had been a success or a failure? Number 2, did they truly understand his pain? Elvis Presley had everything. He had fame, wealth, and the adoration of millions. From the outside, his life looked like a dream. But he was also a man in profound, chronic pain. This pain was not just physical, it was emotional, psychological, and spiritual. The Memphis Mafia were the people who lived with him every day. They saw the symptoms. But did they ever truly understand the source and the depth of his suffering? The emotional pain started early. He was famously devoted to his mother Gladys, and her death in 1958, when he was just 23, devastated him. He never fully recovered. Many of the guys like Red West and Billy Smith knew Gladys. They saw Elvis's grief firsthand. They understood that a light went out in him that day that never came back on. Then there was the pain of his lost twin brother, Jesse Garin, who was stillborn. And Elvis grew up with the sense of being half of a whole, carrying a lifelong burden of survivor's guilt. He spoke about it sometimes, and the guys would listen, but it's a kind of existential pain that is almost impossible for an outsider to fully comprehend. The pain of his career was also real. The frustration of the movie years, the boredom of the Vegas grind. This wasn't just a rich man complaining. It was the pain of an artist who feels their talent is being squandered. He was trapped in a golden cage, forced to sing Old MacDonald in a movie when he wanted to be creating something meaningful. The Mafia saw his frustration, but they may have seen it as a professional problem, not as a deep wound to his soul. And then there was the physical pain. Elvis suffered from a host of health problems, many of which were not publicly known until after his death. He had high blood pressure, an enlarged colon, and glaucoma, which caused severe eye pain. He was not a hypochondriac, he was a genuinely sick man. He used the painkillers initially for real ailments. Dr. Nick's defense was always that he was treating Elvis's chronic pain. The problem was that the treatment became the disease. The Mafia saw him take the pills for pain, so it seemed legitimate, but they may not have distinguished between the pain from his illnesses and the pain of his addiction. The greatest pain of all was his profound loneliness. He was one of the most famous people in the world, yet he was utterly isolated. He couldn't go out, he couldn't have a normal conversation. He was surrounded by his mafia, but even they were not his equals. He was the boss, the king. He had no one to confide in who wasn't on his payroll. This loneliness was a constant ache. The guys tried to fill the void with activity games, parties, conversation, but they couldn't cure the fundamental loneliness of his position. Did they understand all of this? In their memoirs, they show glimpses of understanding. They talk about his sadness over his mother, his frustration with his career. But it's possible they only saw the pieces, not the whole picture. They were trying to manage the day-to-day reality of his moods and his needs. They may not have had the emotional tools or the perspective to step back and see the full mosaic of his suffering. You know, to them, he was Elvis, strong, powerful, the leader. It must have been hard to see him as the deeply wounded man he truly was. What are the questions that remain about his inner world? Are there journals or private notes written by Elvis that reveal the true extent of his pain, which the estate has never released? Did he ever have a complete psychological breakdown that was successfully covered up by the group? And if they could speak to him one last time, would the Memphis Mafia tell him they loved him, or would they tell him they were sorry they didn't understand? Number 1, what is their ultimate legacy, protectors or enablers? After all the stories, all the books, all the accusations and defenses, it comes down to one final question. How should history remember the Memphis Mafia? Were they, at their core, loyal protectors who did their best in an impossible situation? Or were they, ultimately, the enablers who facilitated the tragedy of Elvis Presley's death? The case for them as protectors is powerful and rooted in their origins. They were his friends from home. They guarded his body, they shielded him from a world that wanted to consume him. They provided a bubble of normality, a place where he could be a Southern boy again, playing football and cracking jokes. They sacrificed their own lives and families to be on call for him 24/7. Red and Sonny West were legitimate bodyguards who put their lives on the line for him countless times, dealing with death threats and crazed fans. Jerry Schilling walked away from a promising career in film editing to come back and help his friend. Billy Smith gave his entire adult life to being his cousin's companion. There were countless acts of loyalty, both large and small. They loved him. On this point, none of them have ever wavered. They protected his privacy fiercely. They protected his family. They tried to give him a life, however strange and insulated, when his fame made a normal life impossible. In their best moments, they were his brothers, his keepers, the only people in the world he could truly trust. The case for them as enablers is just as compelling, and it is a tragedy. They enabled his isolation, creating a world where he never had to face reality. They enabled his worst impulses, rarely saying no to his whims, whether it was buying a dozen cars at midnight or indulging in a dangerous diet. They enabled his relationships with compliant doctors, acting as go-betweens for the prescription drugs that would ultimately kill him. They enabled his addiction by normalizing it. For years, they participated in a culture of pill-taking. They created a system where his drug use was not only tolerated but serviced. By failing to unite and stage a meaningful intervention, they enabled his disease to progress unchecked. The book Elvis What Happened may have been a desperate attempt to stop this, but for many it was too little, too late, an admission of their own failure and complicity. So, which is it? The truth is that they were both. They were protectors, and they were enablers. The two roles were not mutually exclusive. In fact, they were tragically intertwined. In protecting him from the outside world, they enabled his private demons to flourish. In protecting his image, they enabled his disease to hide in plain sight. Their loyalty was their greatest virtue, and it was also their fatal flaw. Their love for him made them protect him, but it also made them unable to perform the tough love that might have saved him. Their legacy is therefore a complex and cautionary tale. It's a story about the corrosive nature of fame, the complexities of friendship and employment, and the terrifying power of addiction. They are not simple heroes or villains, they are flawed human beings who were caught in the whirlwind of an extraordinary life, and they are still, to this day, grappling with the consequences. They got to live the dream, but they also had to survive the nightmare. What are the final shocking questions that define their legacy? If they had it to do all over again, knowing the outcome, what is the one single thing they would do differently? Does the preservation of Elvis's musical legacy by fans and his estate absolve the actions of those who were closest to him during his decline? And the most important question of all, is it possible to be a true friend to someone to whom you are also an employee, or is the power imbalance simply too great to overcome?